I'm T-Set, and this is a Tea Time Lapse. This year and onwards, Hourly Comic Day is going to be on February 8th. This is in order to give more attention to the first week of Black History Month. I've never been great about doing Hourly Comic Day. This is only actually my third time doing it. Even though my first time participating was in 2013, it was actually started by Simone Weil in 2006, so it's been around for a while. If you want to see the hourlies of someone who's very good about doing it pretty much every year, I would check out my friend Connie or Curry Square. The past few years I haven't participated because it just wasn't possible with where my health was, but this year I thought, this year I'm healthy enough that I think I can do this. Guys, it took me 3 days to draw what everyone else was drawing in 1 day. But you know, I got it done. I did it. I think it's reasonable that I have to take things at my own pace, considering my chronic illness. One of the challenges presented to me this year is that, unlike the previous years I had participated, I no longer really draw my in-real-life flesh form anymore. I usually draw Fairy T-Set or Minimon instead. So I don't have this very practiced shorthand for it anymore. But I know myself, I have a tendency to be very precious when I'm drawing, so I really tried to keep things simple and to move along and to not be so overly precious with my lines. This means that I didn't spend time referencing hand positions or poses, so things are a little bit messier than I usually like to allow in my finished artwork. But looking at everyone else's hourlies, this was the right decision. If anything, I was probably still a bit too precious, but I'm also unwilling to relinquish that completely. Now, you may notice that I'm drawing these spiky panel borders, and that's because I wanted to visualize my chronic illness in some way. It's something that is ever present in everything I do, and so I wanted it to be incorporated into something ever present in every panel without being something that demands all of your attention all the time, because that's much like how the experience of chronic pain is. It's always there, but you kind of shove it to the side, except for when it spikes and gets worse and demands your attention. I noticed pretty early on that I was drawing at a very slow pace, but I really just didn't think I could speed myself up at all. Not without simplifying things to a point that I wasn't going to be particularly proud of. I just haven't drawn any comics in so long. I really wanted to put some love into this process, even if I was trying to keep it very simple and fast. I've recently picked back up the game Wobble Dogs. It's really silly and goofy. You just kind of take care of and breed weird genetics in these kind of dog-like creatures. On this particular day, I managed to breed a 6-legged dog and also a patterned dog with a really long tail. I had leftover pasta with basil cream sauce, and so I was thawing some shrimp to cook. I did so many drawings of me sitting in bed drawing on my iPad. I really tried to change up the poses and angles of it to make it a bit less repetitive and boring. I don't like how these shrimp turned out. I should have looked up reference for the shrimp, but I was really trying not to rely so much on reference for these because I wanted to get them done quickly. But I wish I had done it anyway. It would have been so fast and they would have turned out better as a result. It's funny, I used to be so bad about using reference for my hands, and now I use it all the time, and so when I force myself to not use reference and to try to just draw it quickly from memory, it really hurts me. I really want to use reference to get the hand positions right. This pain means I'm making progress, right? It means I'm headed in the right direction. I had a few days where my internet was just not running properly, and it made it really hard to watch streams. The internet would be downloading like the normal amount, and then suddenly it would lose connection, and then it would come back. And it would be just enough that I would have to, like, reload the Twitch player. At least this happened while my favorite streamer, Taijiro, is on hiatus. So I was feeling really good the morning that I was working on the hourlies, and I just got so excited about working on them that I forgot to be good about pacing myself and taking breaks. And boy did that come back to bite me. I depicted it by first making the spikes grow larger and more targeted towards my head. I feel like it also kind of communicates the intensity at which I was focusing on drawing, especially when combined with the zooming in on the face. I added a bit more drama by making it underlit. And when I finally stepped back for a moment and realized that it was time for a matcha latte break, I suddenly realized how exhausted and in pain my body was. It wasn't all the way up at a 7, but I was not feeling well and I really needed to rest. Oh, that's a 7 out of 10 on the pain scale, by the way. I live at a 6, and I'm just very used to communicating my pain that way because that's how you communicate it to doctors. For some reason, fatigue is communicated on a scale of 4. I'm not sure why that is. So I visualized having pushed myself too hard with a tear in the panel that has to be mended by resting. I also decided to add a bit of inflammation-like pink gradient to that corner. I'm still thinking of how I could depict fatigue separate from pain. I've had multiple people suggest things that utilize color or color fading into grayscale, but I'd really like to choose something that also works in black and white. So I'm still thinking on it. After laying down for a few hours, I really needed to eat something, even though I really didn't feel like eating food. So I ended up having like a glass of strawberry apple juice, 2 slices of roasted garlic bread with butter on top, and then I think a spoonful of peanut butter. Yeah, real dinner of champions. A big reason why I moved back in with my parents as my health was declining was so that my mom would provide dinners for me, so that I got at least one good meal, but on that particular day it was self-serve. At least I had a good lunch though. And then I watched a bit of my friend Ate Hanimaru's Tavern Talk stream. And this was just me drawing a bit of everyone being goofy with their little fugies. Omega Magus has this little apple bottom jeans, boots with the jeans, jeans, redeem, and they used one of the animations from that as a fugi for a moment, above Gamma's fugi, which was really small on the screen. I'll link all these people in the description. And then I went to bed because I was tired. I've been kind of obsessed with Burnt Cookbook Party, the podcast, for quite a while now, and I really love re-listening to old episodes to fall asleep. I just find it very comfortable. It's a really good TTRPG actual play podcast. I definitely recommend it. And now let's look at the final panels. I think the meds I'm currently on are making me sleep more than usual. No matter how much pain and exhaustion I wake up to, there's always my morning matcha latte to look forward to. Morning habit block. Brush and floss teeth, wash and moisturize face, write in planner, and practice Spanish.
It's Hourly Comic Day!
I could use spiky red borders to communicate the constant chronic pain that accompanies everything I do. More working on hourlies. I'm not a fast drawer. playing Wobble Dogs while eating a breakfast bar because I forgot to eat earlier. More Wobble Dogs! More Wobble Dogs and thawing shrimp for lunch. Drawing more hourlies. Cooking shrimp for lunch. Eating the shrimp with leftover pasta while my internet struggles. More drawing hourlies. More drawing hourlies. And more drawing. Okay, time for a matcha latte break. Oh, I am not feeling well. Reading comics. And resting. I don't feel like eating, but I gotta eat something. You know?
Uh-huh.
Watched Honey's Tavern Talk stream. And bedtime. Where 4 heroes of varying skills, attractiveness, and stupidity race against time to prevent a war. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thank you to all of my patrons for your support. Go ahead.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you.